Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Booktrib Live, a Merrill Moss Media production. Today, we are very excited to welcome IPPY and NIEA award-winning historical and speculative fiction author, KM Weiland. She is an internationally published author of the Amazon bestsellers Outlining Your Novel and Structuring Your Novel, as well as Jane Eyre, the Writer's Digest Annotated Classics. She's also the creator of the very successful blog, helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. It's been among the Writer's Digest 101 best websites for writers in both 2014 and 2015, so make sure if you haven't already, you go check that out. KM has graciously agreed to give away a copy of her recently released Storming, so head over to booktrib.com and you can enter to win by going to the live chat page and leaving a comment below. Welcome, KM. It is so nice to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. Tell us about Storming and the story and the characters that we meet.
Okay, well, this was a special book for me to write. It's set here in my hometown in western Nebraska, for one thing. And I've never had as much fun writing a book as I have with this one. So it's about a barnstorming biplane pilot in 1920s western Nebraska who is coming back to his hometown in Nebraska after quite a long time. He's got a lot of baggage with family that he's not too excited about having to deal with, but there's a big competition, air show competition going on that he really, really wants to win. So he's back in town for that, and on his first night back in town as he's flying around, the unexpected happens when two bodies fall out of nowhere, out of the sky, and so obviously that's something that he's not at all sure what's going on, and it turns out that he ends up connecting with one of the fallen people who is a very strange young woman who doesn't really speak English, who insists that she lives somewhere up in the sky and that he really needs to get with it and help her because there are people up there who are going to cause bad things to happen because, as he discovers, they can control the weather somehow, which of course is all part of the mystery of the story.
Very interesting. Is this a standalone? Will there be others in the group or with the story?
This is a standalone. At this time, you never know what's coming down the line.
Okay.
But at this point, I intend it only to be a standalone kind of a adventure by itself.
Yeah, it's such an interesting and unique premise. How did you come up with this story? Was there any inspiration behind it for you?
Well, that's always a hard question to answer because there are so many different elements that always come together before the story actually gels. But for this one, the very initial bit of inspiration, it was like a lazy Saturday afternoon, and I was laying around watching one of my favorite movies, which is The Greatest Show on Earth, Cecil B. DeMille's old classic. And at the end of the movie, I was just sitting there thinking, my mind was wandering, and I'm wondering, well, what would it be like if one of the circus performers struck up a relationship with a kid that was there in the town where they had just happened, for this one-time stop. Oh. And in my mind, it was a female performer, and I just kind of had this idea immediately for this female character. And it went through a lot of evolutions. The planes ended up coming in and kind of taking over. They became an air show instead of a circus. And then, as it progressed and I started going through these different ideas and finally ended up in its current manifestation. Because it went through things. I always knew there was something about this woman that was strange, unearthly, kind of. And originally she was going to be a dying time traveler, which got totally scratched. So it was one of those things where it just finally, piece by piece, kind of evolved into the Dieselpunk manifestation that it ended up as.
Yeah, and the Dieselpunk adventure novel, you call it. Can you explain that term to anyone who's not familiar with it?
Yes. When I started marketing it, I kind of realized, this is sort of one of those things where maybe it's a little more difficult than not, because a lot of people aren't yet familiar with the term. a lot more people are familiar with the term steampunk, which has become pretty popular in recent years. Basically, steampunk is just kind of modern technology that's steam-powered and set in a historical period, usually the Victorian era. And then there's lots of spin-offs of subgenres from that, and Dieselpunk is one of them. And it's basically like steampunk, but it's set in the period between the world wars, 1920 in this case. So you've got diesel engines, hence the Dieselpunk.
Okay, very interesting. What was the research like for you for this? It's definitely historical. It's set in 1920, I believe. Was that a large part of what went into creating this, or was it a small part? How was that for you?
Yeah, I spend up to a year sometimes on research, and it was really important to me in this one because I'm not a pilot, so I have no idea. I can't hardly even change a tire. So it was really important to me to do the research to get the flying details down right. And thankfully, biplanes are considerably easier to figure out than the jets we have today. But that was a lot of fun, and it was nice too because all of the early aviation books were necessarily also about the time period. So I got a lot of information just about the period by researching the early biplanes and the barnstorming and all of that. So it was a lot of fun, and I was also really lucky to have a couple guys who are familiar with the old planes kind of go over the book and help me from making any major bloopers, hopefully. So it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot.
Very interesting. Storming is your 10th book, if I'm correct, that you've written. Do you approach each one of your books, regardless of topic or genre, in the same way? Do you jump at it with an outline? Are you that kind of author, or what's your beginning process like?
Well, I like to say that every book is kind of its own adventure.
Okay.
Because there's always some new challenge that gets thrown out, and the process is always a little bit different.
Okay.
But I do approach them, in an evolution of the same process every time. And a lot of people know that I'm a huge proponent of outlining through my book, Outlining Your Novel, which probably a lot of the people here have read. But so I'm a big outliner. I spend about 3 months generally just on the outline process. My outlines are very in-depth, to the point that I almost consider them kind of my rough draft.
Oh, wow.
Everything's there except for like dialogue or, actually fleshing it out. And that's what I will do when I then go start to write. Because I like to have, I call it my roadmap. And I like that because then I know exactly where I'm going. And then when I get into the really complicated nitty-gritty of actually having to flesh that out, I can concentrate on that stuff without having to also worry about the macro details of plot and structure. So that's always a really big part of my process. And then, like I say, between 3 to 12 months on research is pretty normal for me, depending on, what the topic is. And then generally about a year for the first draft. Storming was actually, I think it took me like 4 months. So it was one of the fastest books that I've ever written.
Okay. And that actually, we do have a question from a viewer, which I guess it goes along with this. How long does it take you to finish a book, Benjamin would like to know. And how do you know when it's ready to present to your editors? Great question, Benjamin. Thank you.
Well, like I said, it generally takes me an average of 12 months on a first draft, which doesn't include the outlining or the research. And I generally run kind of just on a timeline as far as editing. I like to take 3 years in between books because that allows me to really, focus on editing and getting everything right. And it goes through a lot of, I have some really great beta readers and critique partners, so it goes through all of them pretty much right away after I've finished the first draft. And then toward the end, when it's getting into the last year before publication, it'll go to my editor. And hopefully by that point it's pretty clean and everything. At that point I have hopefully made it as good as I can possibly do on my own. So she doesn't have to mess with stuff that she shouldn't have to, and she can just concentrate on the stuff that I'm totally oblivious to and help me with that.
Okay. So I'd love to talk a little, if you don't mind, about your background, how you got into writing, and have you always known you wanted to be a writer? When did that kind of just say, like, yeah, obviously I'm going to be a writer?
Well, it's kind of funny. My earliest memory is actually of myself. We were at a family reunion or something, and I just have this image of myself up in a treehouse, kind of looking down at everybody, and I'm making up this story about how, I don't know if it was aliens or bad guys or whatever are invading, and I'm going to save everybody. So my earliest memory is of making up a story. But throughout my childhood, I was horse crazy. I was convinced I was going to be a veterinarian until I saw on TV a calf being born, and that was disgusting, so I changed my mind about that. And then I was going to be a horse trainer, and I owned horses and worked with them pretty much through high school. And then just slowly, I had these stories in my head, and I never intended to be a writer, but I loved these stories, and so I'm like, I'll write them down so I don't forget them. And it just kind of took on a life of its own and became this thing that slowly started taking over my time. And I eventually sold my horses when I was finished with high school. And it was pretty much writing from that point on.
Okay. Have you, have horses been at the center of any of your stories, or is that something that you want to do?
Stormy, I think, is actually the first of my novels that hasn't had a single horse in it.
Okay.
But yeah, my first book was a Western, A Man Called Outlaw, which actually is the setting in Wyoming was very much inspired. I used to spend my summers working on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, so there's a lot of kind of personal with the setting, personal stuff with the setting in there. And yeah, and horses have showed up. I write historical fiction a lot and fantasy, so there's always horses cropping up there, which is really nice because it's one of those things that whenever you read articles about authors complaining or readers complaining about how authors aren't getting their facts right or whatever, inevitably people bring up horses. That it's one of those things that it's so easy. There's so many misconceptions because we see them on TV all the time. So it's really nice to have that background kind of to cover my bases in that angle.
I already know what you're talking about. So you have a highly successful blog that you run called Helping Writers Become Authors. Fantastic title, by the way. When did you decide this was a blog you wanted to start and that you wanted to give this advice that you had to writers and authors?
Well, it was one of those things way back it was after my first book had been published and before the second, and I was just, as so many authors do, just kind of floundering and trying to figure out this whole marketing thing. And particularly at that point in time, it was every author has to have a blog. So I'm thinking, what can I blog about that would possibly be interesting to people when, my life is consumed with writing, so what else is there? So like so many other authors, I started just kind of sharing my writing journey. And as it developed, it just kind of took on a life of its own and became something where I could focus on other people's needs and, what they need and what I felt that they were needing in their own writing journey. So it's still something where I'm sharing my writing journey and what I'm learning. I've yet to run out of blog post ideas, I think, simply because I'm always learning and there's always something that I'm discovering in my own writing journey that I can share with other people. So it's been really, really helpful to me too, I think, just in that when you have to teach something and you have to break it down into cognitive pieces that you're spelling out, it's really helpful to me too in processing just kind of some of the feelings and the instincts that I have about storytelling. So I've probably gotten more out of it than anybody has.
Okay. Benjamin is asking, again, along those lines, and I'll put this on screen. For new writers, there's so much to learn. It can be quite expensive. Conferences, online courses. He's got a couple questions here. How can we invest wisely, and how can we kind of avoid being taken advantage of by the ones promising to show you how to write, and really they just want your money?
Well, I think that ultimately, I feel like writers live in such a lucky time, really, right now, because the resources are all at our fingertips to teach ourselves how to write. People ask me often, do I need to go to college? Do I need to get an MFA? And my advice is the best way to learn how to write is simply to write. Mm-hmm. And there are so many wonderful, wonderful resources out there, blogs and books. Personally, I would stick with that. The blogs and the books, are either free or they're very reasonably priced. And you can get as much out of those as you will out of a course. What you get out of a course that you're not going to get out of books and blogs, obviously, is more of the one-on-one contact and critiquing. But honestly, what I would truly recommend when you're ready for that is skip the courses and save your money and hire a good editor. Because then you're going to get something that's much more incisive and personal than you will in a course. Which isn't to say there aren't a lot of great courses out there, but I think that my recommendation would be that the blogs and the books are enough. There's so much information out there that you can really get everything that you need from that.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you again, Benjamin, for that question. How did you get your blog out there? I know so many of us have blogs and they don't necessarily take off. They don't necessarily get off the ground. And I'm just wondering, how did you get it into the atmosphere? Were there some kind of steps that you took or something that, you said, oh, this really works? What did you do? How did you approach it?
Honestly, it's just been kind of a day-by-day, piece-by-piece kind of a thing. Way back in the beginning, social media was definitely a huge jump for me. Right. Twitter has been a really great community for me. I've met so many wonderful people there. In the recent years, I've, also started looking into SEO, search engine optimization, that kind of thing. But honestly, I think the single biggest thing, which does go back to the social media, is just interacting with people and kind of building relationships. Okay. So that your whole focus isn't on just content creation, but you're about, building those relationships and making those connections. And I think that builds on itself eventually.
Okay. We've got quite a really good amount of your questions, so I'm going to ask a few of these. I'm putting Sophie up above with a question. I'm currently reading your book, outlining your novel, but I'm just about to edit my trilogy. Is it too late to outline? Do you think it'll still maybe help me map out my story, though it's already written down?
I actually do. This is something that I do when I have, my story kind of about outlining is I was writing my Portal Fantasy Dreamlander, and I was lazy and decided I didn't want to bother outlining it, and so my first draft was an absolute disaster. Okay. And after that, that's when I pretty much swore I'm never writing a first draft without outlining again. Okay. But what I did with that book was, after, I've got this disaster on my hands, I stopped and I did basically an outline for the rewrite. So a lot of the stuff that was in the first draft, stayed, and it was, already kind of outlined in a sense. But then I was also able to kind of fill in the gaps. Some of the early exercises that I talk about in outlining your novel, like the what if questions, are really helpful for filling in the gaps that you may have in an already completed work, so that you can then kind of create, it's probably not going to end up being the same kind of an outline that you would have for a rough draft, but you'll have an outline that's kind of a checklist for revisions for what you want to do for each chapter that needs to be fixed or deleted or whatever. So yeah, I definitely, if you feel like you've got a big rewrite on your hands, I think outlining can be just as helpful for that as it is in the rough draft.
Oh, okay. Excellent. We have another question. This is from John. He's wondering, does every novel require the classic 3-act structure and its accompanying parts, or can one modify the narrative during story creation, still have that effective plot? We'll take that first.
So the short answer to that would be that I think, yes, all effective stories do have the 3-act structure. But it's definitely something that you can still work within and modify as you go according to the needs. And the thing that I find just absolutely fascinating about structure is that it's based, and I think it's the reason why it's so important and why it works, is that it's so instinctive to the human psyche. It's something that, if you look back, I was reading Homer's The Iliad. So, we're talking, I don't know, what is that, 2000 BC or something? So it's very early. And it's perfectly structured according to the 3-act structure, which, of course, as such, Homer had never heard of.
Right.
So this is something that I think most writers are going to instinctively put into their stories, whether they realize it or not. I'm always a proponent of writers, listening to your gut instinct, because usually what your gut instinct is telling you is how to structure your story. And I think the value of, consciously learning story structure is that you can align, your thinking mind with what your gut is telling you about story structure. So it's very flexible and you can do all kinds of things with it, but I do absolutely recommend sticking with it consciously, and I think that inevitably you'll find that your story adheres to it to one extent or another, even when you aren't conscious of it.
Interesting. His second part of that is, do you fill in the element of the 3 acts as standard, or do you make the slight modifications when you outline before writing?
I always like to, the great part about outlining is that it allows you to get kind of that big picture view of your story. So structure is always something that I'm very aware of during that point, because I want to get it right in the outline so that I don't end up with major revisions necessary down the line. So yes, structure is something that I try my best to get right in the outline. Okay. But inevitably there are always things that need to be tweaked and changed down the line. So I definitely would also give myself the freedom to do that.
Okay. What are some of, your blog is very fact sheet heavy for writers. What are some of the top pieces of advice that you give anyone coming to your blog looking for writing advice and novel writing advice?
Well, I have 3 flagship series on the blog that I always like to send people to, because they're kind of the foundation of everything that I teach. So if you've read those and understand those, then you can kind of follow me with wherever I'm going these days.
Okay.
So one of them is about structuring. Obviously, I think that that's really the foundation of great plot. So I also have one on structuring your story scenes. So it's kind of, you've got story structure on the macro level, and this is story structure on the micro level, which is something that we don't see taught a lot. And it's really instrumental in creating plots that are integral. Every scene is integral to each other from beginning to end, and you don't end up with dead weight, and everything works together. So that's something I definitely recommend writers to check out.
Okay.
And the third one is about character arcs. And this is something that I'm still really excited about. It was something actually that really kind of gelled for me while I was working on the Writer's Digest annotated classic of Jane Eyre. And just kind of was breaking that down, and so I could explain and write about what Charlotte Bronte was doing, that has made her such a wonderful author that we still read her hundreds of years later. And the thing that really popped out at me was the dynamic structure of the character arc. And so that gelled with things that I was already kind of working on. And you can find pretty much, it ended up being my longest series, and it's definitely something where I would recommend starting with story structure, because it's very much based on that. But that would be the next stop that I would recommend. And people can find all 3 of those and some other series that I've done in the top left sidebar on my website, so they're really easy to access.
Fantastic. Thank you for all of that. Just want to point out that there is a chat going on the right that all the viewers are engaged in. KM, they're pretty excited about you talking to them, and appreciate all the advice that you have from what I'm reading. We are just past, almost a month past NaNoWriMo, for which you wrote a fantastic piece for us on Booktrib.com on how to stay motivated during the month of November if you take part in it. Can you give a quick rundown? I imagine most people on here know what NaNoWriMo is, but can you give a quick rundown on what that is, and when did you first start participating in it?
NaNoWriMo is, of course, National Novel Writing Month, which is the big writer event that happens in November. It's this, what I think is just an absolutely inspired idea to try to get people to commit to writing 50,000 words in 1 month, even though it's, for many of us, one of the busiest months of the year. It actually isn't something that I've ever personally participated in. I've always felt that the system that I use is consistent enough, and my motto is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Absolutely.
So it isn't something that I've personally participated in, but I love the idea of it, and I've heard from so many writers that it has helped and really kickstarted and helped them to work through writer's block.
Okay.
So it's something that I'm a big proponent of if you're in any way feeling stuck or in need of motivation. And I think they do one, I think it's in July, maybe June, but Camp NaNoWriMo. So they pretty much do it twice a year.
Okay.
But yeah, I did a couple of posts on that this year if you're interested, that you can look up for next NaNoWriMo. But basically about just the benefits that you glean from that in making you a better writer all throughout the year, and in how to create really solid goals that will allow you to make the most of your very precious time during those busy 30 days in November.
Okay. Are there genres that you still want to write for? Are there things that you have kind of in your back pocket, or maybe a wish list of your own that you're still checking off, things that you want to write?
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place when it comes to genre, which is actually a total nightmare when it comes to marketing. But it's a lot of fun, and it's something that I have been really committed to not nailing myself down to a single genre just for the sake of marketing, because I want that freedom to be able to explore, whatever idea comes knocking. But for the most part, my stories all seem to line up in either, or somewhere in between the two, in either historical or fantasy.
Okay.
And I do see myself moving more and more toward fantasy in the future. I've got a lot of ideas in that area. The next book I'm working on is actually a historical superhero, so that's also kind of a whole new thing that I'm jumping into. Okay. But I don't know, I don't have a checklist per se. I just want to leave that horizon open so that I can explore whatever weird and wonderful idea comes along, whenever it comes along.
Okay, very interesting. You also produce podcasts on your website, which, if anyone has gotten into the podcast recently, you know that they are fantastic. You can subscribe to your podcast, Katie, on iTunes, and also the same name as your blog, Helping Writers Become Authors. Generally, what can someone expect by downloading an episode?
Okay, so basically, my podcasts are just the audio version of what I call the big post that I do every Monday. They run from about 12 to 20 minutes generally. So if you don't want to sit down and read the Monday post, you can subscribe to the podcast, which a lot of people like to do. I actually run the podcast. There's a little audio bar on the bottom of every one of those posts. So you can also find it if you go to the blog and you want to listen to it straight off the site. You can do that. You can listen to it while you're reading along.
Smart.
But yeah, basically it's just the post that you're finding on the blog in audio form to make it more accessible for people who want to listen to it while they're commuting or something like that.
Brilliant. Great idea. And as you just mentioned, coming up, the next thing you're working on, Wayfarer, if that's how you pronounce it, and that's the next book that you had just mentioned, correct?
Yeah, it's going to be the historical superhero book, which was actually a lot of fun. I started out kind of calling it Spider-Man meets Jane Austen, which was a lot of fun. It ended up being a little more Dickensian than Austonian. There were more pickpockets than balls. But it was a lot of fun. I love the whole superhero thing. I'm a big Marvel fan, as anybody who's on my blog knows. So it was just kind of fun to marry those two loves of the speculative superhero craze with a historical novel.
Right.
And I love period movies. I love classic novels. So it was really kind of just a labor of love to really kind of go back to Dickens, who is probably my favorite classic author, and so a lot of those influences into this crazy off-the-wall story. So that was a lot of fun. I just finished the first draft on that. So I'm looking forward to diving into editing on that in the new year.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. We are at the end of our 30 minutes. There are a few more questions down at the bottom, so I'm going to take a few more minutes as long as KM agrees, and I'll ask a couple more questions from the audience. This way we can get a few more people in. Clandestine is asking, how do we write the best thriller and mystery stories? For you, what's the number one thing a writer needs to make it a mind-blowing, insanity-tearing novel? Is there any books that you recommend that have shown or done this that you enjoy?
I'm actually not a big mystery or thriller reader, so I'm not going to probably be the right person to recommend great novels in that line. But I will say that I think the key, and ultimately it's probably the key to any type of story, but particularly in really plot-driven stories like that, I think the key is making sure you're connecting with readers on a very emotional level. You want it to be about the characters in a really raw and visceral way so that they're investing in these people and they care about what's happening to them when the stakes, are off the wall. So, the thriller and the mystery genres are both, relatively, they follow the same pattern. So it's not so much that you're throwing amazing new plot twists in as you're creating these characters that people really care about and want to follow and want to cheer for and want to make sure that they get out of the book safely. So I would definitely concentrate on creating, this really rich characterization that people are going to identify with.
Okay. And Lydia would like to know, it's so amazing that you've come so far, written so many books, and achieved the success that you have. But what advice would you give to a new self-publishing author who's trying to debut? How can we be, quote, discovered?
Okay, well, I think when you are publishing independently, that there are basically two factors in turning that into something successful. And the first one is obviously you have to write, an amazing book that people are going to love and give good reviews to, because that's going to make or break the whole business. Okay. So assuming that you've written something fabulous, the second half of that is totally comes down to marketing. Okay. And that, of course, a lot of authors lament that. It's a totally different hat that you have to wear. But first of all, I would encourage people not to be intimidated by it, because I totally was in the beginning. And it's ended up being something that is really rewarding and fun in its own right. It's kind of like a game, a puzzle, where you're always moving pieces around and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. So I would encourage you, don't be intimidated by it, embrace it. And I think the foundation, there's so many great resources out there on marketing. TheCreativePin.com, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is, one of my top places for kind of getting new ideas and staying on top of what's going on in the industry. So I would recommend that for starters. Okay. But the single biggest thing, I think, in marketing your books is building a platform. You need to find your people, find, the people who are going to be interested and passionate about what you're doing, and build relationships with them so that they, in turn, will not only buy your next book, but will be interested in spreading the word and, helping you with the important things that need to happen, like reviews and that kind of thing. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. The last question we are going to take is from Wayne. This is fun. What is your favorite part of the writing process? That's hard to say. I like to say, that every part of the process has its own really special aspect. And it does. Whenever I'm finished with one part, I'm always like, yay, I get to go on and do the next part. Right. But I have to say that probably my favorite predictably is outlining. I love that part of the process because it's raw creativity. And there isn't all that pressure to get every word right. At that point, it's something that nobody but me is going to see. So I really have the flexibility to just play around with the characters and discover the story and see where things are going with it. So that's probably my all-time favorite part of writing. Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our chat today. KM, I can't thank you enough for joining us and answering all of the fantastic questions to the viewers. Thank you so much for joining in. It has been very fun.
And I just want to remind everyone, don't forget, Storming, you can get it at booktrib.com. You can enter to win. Go to the live chat page and comment on the page to be entered for that. Thank you again, KM. I really appreciate it. It was a blast to get to talk today.
Thank you. It was really fun to be here. And I'll just throw out that if there were questions that people had that they weren't able, that I wasn't able to answer, that they are totally welcome to drop by my blog and hit contact and send them to me, and I'll be happy to answer anything that we weren't able to get to. So Excellent. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much. Everyone, have a great weekend. Bye.